Dr. Marcus J. Reynolds had no idea that an ordinary day would soon take an extraordinary turn, sparking an event that would ripple throughout his entire community. Dr. Reynolds, a distinguished physician known for his warm smile and commitment to helping underserved families, was a beloved figure in his small town. With years of service under his belt, he had become more than just a doctor. He was a symbol of care and compassion to all who knew him. For him, today was just another day off, a rare opportunity to relax and enjoy something different from his usual routine. His colleagues had been raving about a new restaurant that recently opened in town, promising an upscale dining experience with flavors inspired by international cuisines. Intrigued, Dr. Reynolds decided to treat himself, looking forward to an evening of good food and relaxation. As he approached the restaurant, he admired its stylish exterior, with modern lighting and a steady stream of people heading inside. He noticed a few familiar faces, townspeople who greeted him with smiles or a wave. Everyone knew Dr. Reynolds, and he was as much a part of the town as its historic clock tower or annual summer festival. But as he reached the hostess stand and asked for a table, he sensed something was off. The hostess, a young woman with a seemingly friendly smile, paused, her expression faltering when she looked up and saw him. She seemed hesitant, almost as if she were surprised by his presence, though she quickly masked it with a professional tone. "Good evening. Table for one," she asked, though her eyes darted toward the manager standing nearby, a stern-looking man who was clearly observing their interaction with interest. Dr. Reynolds smiled and nodded, not thinking too much of it at first. But the atmosphere shifted when the manager approached, placing a hand on the hostess's shoulder before she could continue. He was a tall man with an air of authority, dressed in a crisp shirt and tie, and he wasted no time speaking up. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're fully booked for the night," the manager said, his voice polite but noticeably tense. Dr. Reynolds glanced around. He could see several empty tables near the back, and a few others that looked recently vacated, their chairs neatly pushed in. The restaurant was busy, but not so much that it seemed fully booked. Confused, Dr. Reynolds maintained his smile, figuring perhaps it was a mistake or simply an issue with reservation timing. "That's all right. I'm happy to wait if needed," he replied calmly. But the manager's face hardened, his polite mask slipping just enough to reveal something colder beneath. "I'm afraid waiting won't make a difference, sir. We simply cannot accommodate you this evening," the manager stated, his tone definitive. The words hung in the air like an invisible barrier. Nearby patrons cast curious glances, some whispering to one another, sensing the tension. Dr. Reynolds, still trying to keep the exchange civil, asked, "I see. Is there a reason you can't seat me tonight? I noticed a few empty tables." The manager's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening, as if the question itself were offensive. "As I mentioned, we are fully booked. It's restaurant policy not to go over capacity," he replied curtly, his tone leaving no room for argument. In that moment, Dr. Reynolds felt an all-too-familiar sensation, a prickling awareness that this was not just a matter of reservations or table availability. He was being denied service, not because the restaurant was truly full, but for reasons the manager didn't have the courage to voice. Dr. Reynolds had encountered subtle biases before, even in his line of work, where patients sometimes doubted his competence until they realized he was, in fact, the doctor they had come to see. But this was different. This was blatant, right in front of everyone, an invisible line drawn between him and the dining experience he'd come to enjoy. Standing there, he felt a rush of emotions: frustration, disappointment, and even a flicker of embarrassment. But Dr. Reynolds was a man of composure, and he had learned over the years that sometimes the most powerful response is to remain calm and dignified. He took a deep breath, his mind racing as he weighed his options. Part of him wanted to walk away, to avoid making this scene or causing trouble. Yet another part, the part that valued fairness and integrity, told him that he had to stand his ground. Before he could decide what to do next, something unexpected happened. One of the patrons, an elderly woman who had been observing the exchange, stood up and approached him. She gently placed a hand on his arm, offering him a kind smile filled with understanding. "Is there a problem, doctor?" she asked, her voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Her question broke the silence, and suddenly, more eyes were on him. Dr. Reynolds managed a small smile, thankful for her support. "It seems they don't have room for me tonight," he replied, his tone light, but carrying a hint of the frustration he felt. The woman turned to the manager, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "Well, that's strange," she said pointedly, "because I can see a few empty tables right over there." The manager shifted uncomfortably, glancing from the woman to Dr. Reynolds, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. "Ma'am, I assure you, news of the incident spread like wildfire across the small town, reaching every corner, every coffee shop, every workplace. People talked about Dr. Marcus Reynolds, a man they all knew and respected, being refused service at the town's newest restaurant for what seemed like no reason. At that moment, something remarkable happened. A young waitress, barely in her 20s, stepped forward. She looked nervous, her eyes darting between Dr. Reynolds and the manager, but she took a deep breath and raised her voice. "I don't think it's fair either," she said, her voice shaking slightly but full of conviction. "I've seen people treated differently here before, and it's not right." Her words shocked everyone. The crowd fell silent, and the manager's face went pale. For a brief moment, no one moved, the gravity of her words hanging heavily in the air. The young waitress had taken a risk, and her voice had given the gathering an unexpected power. Dr. Reynolds looked at her, a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. She had voiced what he had been feeling, what so many others had felt in the past, but hadn't dared to say. Inspired by her bravery, another patron, an older man who had been watching from the corner, stepped forward and added, "This isn't just about Dr. Reynolds. It's about how we treat everyone in this town. If we don't stand up now, when will we?" His words ignited a ripple of agreement through the crowd, and more voices joined in, calling for fairness, unity, and respect. Faced with an undeniable wave of solidarity, the manager seemed to shrink, his authority slipping away with every passing second. He attempted to salvage the situation, stammering an insincere apology, but the crowd was no longer interested in his excuses. What had started as an isolated incident had evolved into a town-wide movement for change, a rallying cry for dignity and justice. In that moment, Dr. Reynolds realized that his quiet act of resistance had tapped into something far greater than himself. This wasn't just about a meal denied. It was about a community that was ready to stand together, to demand the respect that each of its members deserved. Dr. Reynolds looked around, his heart swelling with pride at the strength and unity of his community. This wasn't the outcome he had anticipated, but it was one he would cherish forever. The incident was no longer a personal slight. It was a testament to the power of unity, the courage of speaking up, and the strength that can be found when ordinary people stand together for what is right. With a calm but firm voice, he addressed the crowd. "Thank you, all of you, for your support. This is our community, and we're stronger together. I hope this serves as a reminder that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, no matter who they are." His words were met with applause, the sound of hands clapping filling the restaurant, an unspoken agreement that change was not only possible but necessary. Leaving the restaurant that day, Dr. Reynolds knew that his journey was far from over. The incident had brought people together, shedding light on issues they could no longer ignore. It was a day that would be remembered, not for the discrimination he faced, but for the unity and strength it had inspired in his community. And as he walked away, surrounded by friends and strangers alike, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet determination to continue fighting for dignity, justice, and the belief that one voice could indeed make a difference. As Dr. Reynolds walked away from the restaurant that day, he couldn't have foreseen the way his quiet act of defiance would unfold into a full-blown movement. The community's unexpected support stirred something within the town. What had been a murmured outrage behind closed doors now became the primary topic of discussion everywhere. From the grocery store aisles to the church halls, people were talking. Some spoke of the injustice Dr. Reynolds faced, while others shared their own experiences with prejudice. It was as if his story had opened a door, and once opened, the flood of buried stories, grievances, and long-held frustrations poured out. But not everyone in town was supportive. Some people, particularly those who frequented the restaurant, were quick to defend it, claiming it was just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. A few business owners quietly muttered that Dr. Reynolds should have let the matter rest and moved on. "He's a doctor," they said, as if his status should have insulated him from prejudice, or worse, made him immune to the effects of it. A certain quiet tension filled the town as people took sides, yet the feeling of change persisted. For every person who defended the restaurant, there were many more who expressed anger, empathy, or simply a newfound awareness of the injustices that often lurked beneath the town's polished surface. The momentum continued to build when an unlikely ally stepped into the fray. Reverend James Monroe, the pastor of one of the town's oldest churches and a respected figure known for his passionate sermons and community involvement. Reverend Monroe had been in the town for decades, having led countless community drives and hosted town hall meetings. He had seen the town change over the years, but he understood that some things had remained stubbornly the same. When he heard about Dr. Reynolds' experience, he knew he couldn't stay silent. One Sunday morning, he addressed the congregation in his usual booming voice, his eyes fierce and his tone unwavering. "My friends," he began, "we like to think of ourselves as good people, a loving community. But what does it mean to be loving if we turn a blind eye to our neighbor's pain? What does it mean to be good if we allow prejudice to go unchecked in our midst? Dr. Reynolds is our brother. His experience is a reminder to all of us that no one is truly free until everyone is treated with dignity and respect." His sermon struck a chord, and soon people were inspired to take action. A group of young activists, many of whom had grown up in the town but had always felt marginalized, started organizing meetings to discuss issues of discrimination and bias within the community. They began sharing stories, collecting testimonies from those who had faced discrimination in different forms. And Dr. Reynolds, though reluctant at first to take on a public role, found himself drawn into these meetings, moved by the stories and experiences that mirrored his own. His initial discomfort at the attention he'd garnered was quickly overshadowed by a deep sense of purpose. He saw that his quiet act of resistance had given a voice to those who had never felt heard. One evening, he sat in the town hall with a group of young people and older residents who had gathered to discuss their experiences. It was a somber, sometimes painful exchange, with stories of denied jobs, uncomfortable stares, and whispered insults. One young woman, who worked as a waitress in a different restaurant, shared that she often had to deal with rude remarks from patrons who assumed she didn't belong. Another elderly man spoke of a lifetime of fitting in by hiding parts of himself, never daring to speak up for fear of alienation. As the stories unfolded, Dr. Reynolds listened intently, his heart heavy but filled with a growing resolve. When it was his turn to speak, he shared not only his recent experience at the restaurant, but also his own lifelong journey of learning to navigate a world that often tried to place limits on him. "I used to think that if I worked hard enough, if I was successful enough, then I'd earn my place. I thought that eventually the world would see me as an equal," he admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I've realized that equality doesn't come from keeping our heads down or staying quiet. It comes from demanding respect, for ourselves and for each other." The meeting had a powerful impact, sparking a collective determination to create a lasting change within the town. In the days that followed, the group expanded its efforts, distributing flyers and organizing small rallies outside local businesses to raise awareness about discrimination. They held workshops on inclusivity and diversity, inviting community members to participate and share their thoughts. Local newspapers picked up the story, bringing even more attention to the movement. Meanwhile, The restaurant where Dr. Reynolds had been denied service struggled under the weight of the backlash. Negative reviews flooded social media, with people sharing their disappointment and disgust at how the incident had been handled. Customers canceled reservations, and a few vendors even began reconsidering their contracts. The restaurant's owner, a man who had stayed in the shadows until now, finally emerged, desperate to salvage his business. He issued a public statement, offering a carefully worded apology that many saw as insincere. But the community wasn't interested in hollow apologies. They wanted accountability, they wanted change, and they wanted to see a commitment to inclusivity that went beyond words. The turning point came one afternoon when a letter arrived at Dr. Reynolds' office. It was from the restaurant owner, requesting a private meeting. Reluctantly, Dr. Reynolds agreed, unsure of what to expect. When they met, the owner appeared visibly shaken, his usually confident demeanor replaced by an air of uncertainty. He apologized profusely, admitting that he hadn't fully grasped the impact of the incident. He spoke of wanting to make things right, to turn the restaurant into a place where everyone felt welcome. Dr. Reynolds listened, his face impassive. He understood that apologies were easy to make, but meaningful change was far harder to achieve. Instead of accepting the apology outright, he challenged the owner. "If you're truly serious about making things right," he said, "you need to do more than just apologize. You need to show this community that you're willing to learn, to grow, and to commit to real inclusivity. Host one of our workshops in your restaurant. Invite people to share their stories and listen to what they have to say. That's how you begin to repair trust." The owner hesitated, visibly uncomfortable at the thought of such an open forum. But seeing the quiet resolve in Dr. Reynolds' eyes, he knew he had no other choice. He agreed to host a community gathering at the restaurant, inviting people from all backgrounds to come and share their experiences. When the day of the gathering arrived, the restaurant was filled with locals. Some came to share their stories, others to listen, but all were there with a shared purpose. Dr. Reynolds stood at the front, guiding the conversation, encouraging people to speak openly about the challenges they have faced. The atmosphere was tense at first, but as more voices were heard, a sense of unity began to emerge. Even the restaurant owner, who had once seemed so distant and disconnected, listened intently, nodding with understanding and asking questions. By the end of the evening, the restaurant felt transformed. It wasn't just a place to eat. It had become a space for healing and connection. People lingered long after the formal gathering had ended, talking, laughing, and sharing in a way that hadn't seemed possible before. Dr. Reynolds watched the scene, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. The journey had been difficult, and there were still challenges to face, but he knew that change had taken root. As he left the restaurant that night, Dr. Reynolds felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. His quiet act of defiance had sparked a movement, one that had the power to transform his town from within. And as he walked home, the streets filled with familiar faces and warm smiles, he knew that his community had taken its first steps toward becoming a place where everyone truly belonged. The night of the gathering marked a pivotal shift, not just for Dr. Reynolds, but for the entire community. It was as though a dormant energy had been awakened, a collective realization that this town, which they had all considered their home, had unseen cracks in its foundation, cracks that allowed prejudice and discrimination to creep in. Yet through Dr. Reynolds' experience and the courageous conversations that had taken place within the walls of that restaurant, the community had found a way to begin addressing these issues head-on. The next morning, conversations were buzzing everywhere. In the coffee shops, at the grocery stores, on front porches. People who had never given a second thought to discrimination were discussing it openly, and those who had long felt its sting now had a voice. The town was shifting, but change doesn't come without resistance. Some residents were skeptical, wary of what they saw as a needless disruption to the town's peace. Among them were business owners who feared the negative publicity might deter customers from visiting, damaging the town's reputation. They began to whisper among themselves, questioning why a respected figure like Dr. Reynolds would stir things up and force people to confront issues that many had comfortably ignored. This town was doing just fine before all this, one man said to his friends over coffee. Why couldn't he just let it be? But while some felt that way, others were inspired. A group of local high school students, motivated by Dr. Reynolds' quiet stand, organized a diversity council at their school. They wanted to educate their peers, to encourage discussions about acceptance and unity. For the first time, students were encouraged to speak openly about their backgrounds, cultures, and identities, sharing personal stories that brought them closer together. In a town that had never openly celebrated its diversity, this was revolutionary. Dr. Reynolds was invited to speak at their first meeting, and he was moved by the courage of these young people who were determined to make a difference in their own lives and the lives of others. The ripple effects of that night continued. Dr. Reynolds was approached by a city council member who had attended the gathering, a woman named Laura Evans, who had been quietly advocating for social justice initiatives in the town for years, but had often faced opposition. Laura, inspired by Dr. Reynolds' impact, proposed an official town event to promote inclusion and celebrate the town's diversity. It would be a community-wide festival, with music, food, and storytelling that reflected the different cultures within the town. Marcus, Laura said to him one afternoon over coffee, I think what you've started here is something this town has needed for a long time. Let's make sure it's something we continue. With renewed energy, Dr. Reynolds threw himself into planning the event alongside Laura and other community leaders. The idea was to create a day where people could learn about each other, where differences would be celebrated rather than quietly ignored. Flyers went up in shop windows. Announcements were made at schools and churches, and slowly but surely, the town began to anticipate the upcoming festival. Of course, not everyone was supportive. The same group of resistant townsfolk scoffed at the idea, muttering about how unnecessary it was and how the town never used to need things like this. But as the day of the festival drew closer, the excitement in the air was palpable. On the morning of the event, a crowd gathered in the town square, which had been transformed with colorful decorations, food stalls, and a small stage. Local musicians played cheerful tunes, vendors sold traditional foods from various backgrounds, and people gathered in groups, talking, laughing, and sharing stories. Dr. Reynolds watched from the edge of the square, filled with pride and hope. This was the town he had always believed in, one where people came together, where community meant more than just living in the same place. As the day unfolded, he noticed something that truly touched him. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years were connecting. He saw the elderly woman from the gathering at the restaurant chatting warmly with a young family she'd likely never interacted with before. Nearby, a group of teenagers laughed as they shared food from a stall selling dishes from the local immigrant community. It was as if barriers had dissolved, replaced by genuine curiosity and kindness. People weren't just tolerating each other. They were actively learning about each other, bridging gaps that had existed for too long. Then, in the afternoon, it was time for the storytelling portion of the festival. Dr. Reynolds had been invited to speak, but he wasn't alone. A lineup of residents from different backgrounds had agreed to share their personal journeys, their struggles, and their dreams. The first speaker was a young woman named Anna, who had immigrated to the town with her parents as a child. She spoke about her experience of feeling like an outsider, of struggling to learn the language and fit in, and of finally finding her place in the community. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but the crowd listened with rapt attention, her words resonating deeply with many who had faced similar feelings of isolation. Next was an older man named Mr. Jenkins, a retired teacher who had lived in the town his entire life. He shared his journey of overcoming personal biases, of realizing the importance of empathy, and of learning to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes. He admitted with humble honesty that he had once been one of the people who resisted change, who preferred things to stay the same. "What I've come to see," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "that change is not something to fear. It's something to embrace, something that makes us better, that makes us stronger as a community." Finally, it was Dr. Reynolds' turn. Standing in front of the crowd, he took a moment to gather his thoughts, looking out at the faces of the people who had become a part of his journey. "This day," he began, his voice steady but filled with warmth, "is not just about me or my story. It's about all of us. It's about recognizing that we each have a role to play in making this town a place where everyone belongs. This journey started with an act of exclusion, but it's ending with an act of inclusion. And that is the beauty of community. The power to come together and transform something painful into something beautiful." The crowd erupted in applause, and as he looked out at the sea of faces, Dr. Reynolds felt a profound sense of accomplishment. He had never set out to become a symbol or to lead a movement. All he had wanted was a quiet meal, a moment of peace. But life has a way of taking ordinary moments and turning them into something extraordinary. What had begun as a painful experience of rejection had blossomed into an opportunity for growth, unity, and hope. As the festival continued and day turned into evening, people lingered, reluctant to let go of the feeling of togetherness. Conversations flowed, laughter echoed through the square, and friendships were forged. Dr. Reynolds knew that not every heart had been changed, that not everyone in the town had been moved by the festival. But he also knew that they had taken a monumental step forward. They had created a foundation for a future where no one would feel like an outsider, where people would be judged by their character and not by their background. In the days that followed, the impact of the festival continued to be felt throughout the town. Schools introduced programs on inclusivity. Local businesses pledged to uphold fair and welcoming practices, and conversations about diversity became part of everyday life. The restaurant where the initial incident had occurred even introduced new training sessions for their staff, hoping to rebuild trust and show their commitment to change. And Dr. Reynolds, he returned to his daily routine, back to his practice, back to his patients. But he was not the same man he had been before. He carried with him the memory of that festival, the feeling of standing in front of his community and seeing unity where there had once been division. His quiet resilience had sparked something profound, a movement that transcended him, one that belonged to the community itself. Months later, when he looked back on the entire experience, Dr. Reynolds realized that the most powerful change had not been in the policies or practices that emerged, but in the hearts and minds of the people. The festival had shown them a glimpse of what their town could be, a place where everyone felt they belonged, where each person's story mattered. And as he reflected on everything that had happened, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that he had been part of something that would endure, something that would shape the town for generations to come. In the end, his quiet act of defiance had planted the seeds of a lasting transformation, a legacy of unity and strength, built one story, one voice, one heart at a time. As the festival faded into memory, the echoes of that transformative day lingered in the town, creating ripples that continued to affect both individuals and institutions. Dr. Reynolds' stand against discrimination had sown the seeds of change, and now the town was tasked with nurturing those seeds into a lasting legacy. The community found itself in a period of self-reflection, and what had once been whispered in private corners was now discussed openly. Conversations around respect, inclusion, and equality were no longer avoided or minimized, but had instead become integral to the town's social fabric. One unexpected consequence of the festival's success was the reaction from neighboring towns. People from surrounding areas had heard about Dr. Reynolds' story and the powerful movement it had sparked. Nearby communities started inviting him to speak at their events and gatherings, seeking inspiration and guidance for how to foster similar conversations about unity and inclusivity. Dr. Reynolds, though initially hesitant to embrace this newfound role, found himself drawn to the opportunity to share what he had learned. He traveled to schools, community centers, and town halls, speaking to audiences eager to understand the journey that his town had embarked upon. His calm but compelling storytelling touched countless lives, and he realized that his experience had a far greater impact than he'd ever anticipated. At home, the town council, inspired by the festival's success and spurred by community demand, proposed a new series of community initiatives aimed at building a more inclusive environment. These initiatives included diversity training programs for local businesses, educational workshops for schools, and forums where citizens could discuss issues openly and respectfully. They even developed a mentorship program where older residents who had lived through decades of social change could share their stories and insights with the town's youth. Dr. Reynolds was asked to serve on the committee overseeing these initiatives, a role he accepted with a sense of responsibility and pride. However, not all responses were positive. While many embraced the movement, there was a small but vocal group of residents who were resistant to the changes. They argued that the town was losing its identity, that this push for inclusivity was unnecessary and disruptive. Rumors circulated that Dr. Reynolds and others advocating for change were outsiders in their own town, even though they had lived there for years. These voices grew louder, casting a shadow over the positive momentum. But Dr. Reynolds was undeterred. He knew that change, especially transformative change, often brought discomfort. He reminded himself, and those who supported him, that their efforts were not meant to divide, but to unite. The resistance only deepened his resolve to make this town a place where every person felt valued and respected. One day, Dr. Reynolds received an unexpected visit from an elderly man named Henry Clark. Henry had been one of the most vocal critics, openly opposing the town's new focus on inclusivity and questioning the necessity of these changes. Yet, as he stood on Dr. Reynolds' doorstep, his demeanor was different, hesitant, even apologetic. Dr. Reynolds invited him in, offering him a seat and a cup of coffee, sensing that Henry had something important to say. After a few moments of silence, Henry finally spoke, his voice softer than usual. "I owe you an apology, Marcus," he began, using Dr. Reynolds' first name for the first time. "I thought all this talk about change was just stirring up trouble. I've lived here my whole life, and I liked things the way they were. But my granddaughter came home from school the other day, and she was talking about the diversity program they introduced. She told me how she'd learned about other cultures, how she met a new friend who shared stories about her family's traditions. And you know what? She was so happy. She told me it was the first time she felt like she could truly be herself at school." Henry paused, his eyes misty with emotion. "I realized then that maybe I've been wrong. Maybe I've been holding on to an idea of this town that doesn't fit anymore. And I realize that what you're doing here, it's not just for you. It's for people like my granddaughter. For people who deserve to feel like they belong." Dr. Reynolds listened in silence, deeply moved. Henry's confession was a powerful reminder that even the most resistant hearts could be touched by empathy and understanding. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder. "Thank you, Henry. It means a lot to hear that from you. Change isn't easy, especially when it asks us to question things we've known all our lives. But what we're building here, it's for everyone, including you. I'm glad you're here." The two men sat in silence for a moment, each absorbing the significance of the conversation. Dr. Reynolds knew that Henry's change of heart, though a small victory, symbolized the larger shift happening in the town. If someone like Henry could see the importance of inclusivity, there was hope that others would too. The following months were marked by both progress and challenges. The diversity initiatives gained momentum, with more community members stepping up to volunteer and support the cause. Local artists created murals celebrating the town's unity, depicting scenes of people from different backgrounds working together, sharing meals, and building a stronger community. The murals became beloved symbols, a constant reminder of the town's commitment to change. Yet, the town's journey wasn't without obstacles. Some local businesses initially resisted the inclusivity training sessions, dismissing them as unnecessary. However, Dr. Reynolds and his fellow committee members worked patiently, meeting with business owners individually to address their concerns and explain the purpose behind these changes. Slowly but surely, even the most skeptical business owners began to see the value in fostering an environment where all customers felt welcome. One particularly challenging situation arose with the high school's athletic department. A few students of color had come forward, sharing experiences of subtle but persistent bias from certain coaches and teammates. The principal, aware of the broader changes sweeping the town, was supportive of the students and immediately reached out to Dr. Reynolds for guidance. He suggested organizing a series of dialogues between the students and staff, creating a space where everyone could share their perspectives and find common ground. The first dialogue session was tense, with raw emotions surfacing as students and coaches spoke openly for the first time. Dr. Reynolds attended as a facilitator, guiding the conversation with empathy and respect. At one point, a young athlete named Jay spoke up, his voice shaking as he described feeling overlooked, dismissed, and at times even unwelcome. His courage inspired others to share their own experiences, creating a powerful moment of collective vulnerability. One of the coaches, visibly moved, admitted that he had never considered the impact of his actions and words. "I'm sorry, Jay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never realized how my words affected you. I was raised to believe that everyone should be treated the same. But I understand now that treating everyone the same doesn't mean treating everyone fairly." The session ended with a feeling of relief and healing, as both students and staff found common ground in their shared commitment to respect and inclusivity. Dr. Reynolds left the school that day with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that these small victories were building the foundation for a better future. As the seasons changed, the town continued to transform. New traditions were born, like an annual Unity Day, where the community gathered to celebrate their diversity and reflect on their shared values. Schools and businesses alike embraced the principles of inclusivity, incorporating them into everyday practices and policies. Even the local newspaper, once hesitant to cover stories related to social change, began publishing regular columns on community building and respect, inviting residents to share their stories and perspectives. Dr. Reynolds continued his work quietly, always guided by the belief that meaningful change was a journey, not a destination. He had become a beloved figure, not because he sought attention, but because he embodied the values that the town aspired to uphold. He was a gentle, unwavering reminder that dignity and respect could flourish anywhere, even in the smallest of towns, if people were willing to open their hearts and minds. As time passed, Dr. Reynolds often found himself reflecting on the journey that had started with one painful experience of exclusion. He knew that the work was never truly finished, that there would always be room for growth and improvement. But as he walked through the town square one quiet evening, watching children play under the murals, families gathering in the cafe, and neighbors greeting one another warmly, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had once been denied a seat at a restaurant, but in the end, he had found something far greater, a place in the hearts of his community and a legacy of unity and compassion that would outlast him. As he walked home, his thoughts drifted to the future, to the generations who would inherit this town and continue the journey he had begun. He hoped they would carry forward the lessons learned, building a world where every person, no matter their background, could stand tall and proud, knowing they truly belonged. And as he reached his doorstep, he turned to look back at the town he had helped to transform, feeling a quiet but profound joy. In his heart, he knew that he had helped to plant seeds of hope, compassion, and unity, seeds that would continue to bloom for years to come. As years passed, the town continued to thrive in ways that no one could have anticipated. Dr. Reynolds' impact, though rooted in a single incident, had blossomed into a legacy that wove through the lives of everyone in the community. The initial tension and resistance that once defined the town's reaction had softened, replaced by a broader understanding and acceptance of the values that Dr. Reynolds and his supporters had championed. The community that had once prided itself on being close-knit had grown even closer, not because they ignored their differences, but because they learned to respect and embrace them. One of the most powerful symbols of this transformation was the annual Unity Day Festival, an event that now drew people from neighboring towns and cities. It had grown far beyond the original vision, evolving from a single day of celebration into a week-long series of events that highlighted the community's diversity, resilience, and strength. Every year, Unity Week began with a town-wide storytelling night where residents gathered to share personal stories of struggle, hope, and triumph. This wasn't just about recounting the challenges people had overcome. It was about understanding one another in deeper ways, about realizing the shared humanity that connected them all. People who had once been strangers found connections in each other's stories, and every year, new faces would step forward to share their experiences. Dr. Reynolds became a cherished figure at these events, often opening Unity Week with a reflection on the journey that had brought them all together. His words never failed to move the crowd, and each year he noticed new faces looking back at him. Young children who had only heard about the town's transformation through their parents, teenagers eager to embrace the community's values, and newcomers who had chosen to make the town their home precisely because of its welcoming spirit. His heart swelled with pride each time he looked out at this growing community, realizing that his once quiet act of defiance had left an indelible mark. In the 5th year of Unity Week, something extraordinary happened that further solidified Dr. Reynolds' legacy. A group of high school students who had been inspired by his story decided to undertake a project documenting the town's transformation. They interviewed longtime residents, newcomers, and even those who had initially resisted the changes, capturing a multitude of perspectives to create a comprehensive account of how one man's experience had reshaped the town. They called it The Story of Us, a community reborn, and the project was unveiled during that year's Unity Week. The students had compiled not only interviews but also letters, photographs, and even drawings from young children who saw the town through eyes unclouded by prejudice. The documentary left a lasting impression on everyone who watched it. For the older generation, it was a testament to the changes they had witnessed. For the younger generation, it was a reminder of the values they would need to carry forward. The Students' Project was soon made available online, and as it began circulating beyond the town, it attracted attention from community leaders, educators, and activists nationwide. Invitations poured in, asking Dr. Reynolds and the students to share their story and the lessons they had learned. What had started as a local initiative was now inspiring communities far and wide, igniting conversations about inclusion, unity, and the power of small acts to create substantial change. Over time, the Story of Us was adopted into the town's curriculum, becoming part of a larger effort to ensure that the lessons of the past were not forgotten. Teachers used the project to spark discussions in classrooms, encouraging students to consider their own roles in building a respectful and supportive community. Dr. Reynolds visited schools regularly, often accompanied by some of the students who had worked on the project. Together, they spoke about the importance of standing up for what is right, of choosing kindness over indifference, and of understanding that everyone's story has value. As Unity Week continued to grow, so did Dr. Reynolds' quiet legacy. He had never sought fame or recognition. His only goal had been to ensure that his town was a place where everyone could feel safe and respected. But fate had other plans, and he found himself receiving awards, invitations, and even a community service medal from the state. At first, he had hesitated to accept the accolades, feeling that the work was still unfinished. But over time, he realized that these honors were not for him alone. They represented the countless people who had come together to make a difference, each one playing a role in the town's transformation. One evening, Dr. Reynolds was sitting on a park bench, watching children play around the colorful murals that now adorned many of the town's walls. These murals, painted by local artists, were a vivid representation of the town's journey, depicting scenes of unity, resilience, and compassion. As he watched, he was joined by a young woman named Mia, who had been one of the high school students behind The Story of Us. Mia had since graduated and was now attending college in a nearby city, studying social work with the hope of helping other communities create the same kind of change she had witnessed in her hometown. Dr. Reynolds, she began, her voice soft but filled with admiration. Do you ever think about how different things would be if you hadn't stood up that day? I mean, none of this would have happened. You changed everything." He turned to her, smiling gently. "Mia, I didn't change everything. I just opened a door. The rest of you, the community, the students, the leaders, you all chose to walk through it. This journey belongs to each of us, and it will continue long after I'm gone, because it's become a part of who we are." Mia nodded, understanding his words but still awed by his humility. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the scene around them. The park was filled with people of all ages, backgrounds, and stories, laughing together, sharing food, and basking in the warmth of a community that had learned to embrace each person's unique contributions. As dusk settled, they were joined by Reverend Monroe, Laura Evans, and several other community members who had been instrumental in the early days of the movement. Each carried their own memories of the journey, each feeling a sense of quiet pride and accomplishment. They reminisced, sharing stories of the challenges they had overcome, the resistance they had faced, and the victories they had celebrated. Together, they reflected on how far the town had come, on the unlikely paths that had led each of them to be part of this shared story. Eventually, Dr. Reynolds rose, bidding his friends good night. As he walked through the town square, he noticed the mural painted on the wall of the very restaurant where his journey had begun. The image depicted hands of different colors, reaching toward each other in unity, encircled by the words, "Stronger together." He paused, taking in the powerful message that now stood as a testament to the town's evolution. At that moment, he was filled with a profound sense of peace. The legacy of his quiet stand for justice had outgrown him, had become woven into the fabric of the town's identity. It was no longer just his story. It was the story of a community that had chosen to look beyond differences and find strength in unity. The town was a testament to what could be achieved when people came together with open hearts and a shared vision for a better future. As he made his way home, Dr. Reynolds felt the weight of his journey lift, replaced by a gentle contentment. He knew that the town's story would continue to unfold, that new challenges would arise and new leaders would emerge. And he knew that, just as he had once been called to act, others would step forward to carry on the legacy of unity, compassion, and respect. In his heart, Dr. Reynolds felt a quiet joy. He had given his community a gift. The gift of understanding, of empathy, and of a commitment to each other that would endure. And as he closed his door that night, he knew that his work was complete. The seeds he had planted had taken root, blossoming into something beautiful and lasting, something that would inspire future generations to walk in unity, always remembering that a single act of courage could change the world.